The noise was the first lie, a frantic, manufactured chaos designed to swallow the truth. It bounced off the polished floors of Boston S. Logan International Airport, a symphony of insincere apologies and hurried footsteps. I was 75 years old, and I was being erased. Mum. I just don't understand it. David S.'s voice was pitched a little too high the way it always was when he was lying. He was 48, a man who still looked to his wife for his next line. The agent said it's not in the system. Your confirmation number. It is just not there. He wouldn't look at me. His eyes, the same pale blue as my own, darted everywhere but my face. They scanned the departures board, the line of impatient travellers behind us, the crisp uniform of the check-in agent, who looked on with practiced neutrality. Anywhere but at the woman who gave birth to him. Sarah, his wife, played her part with more conviction. She was a performer, always had been. She placed a hand on my arm, her nails, a perfect blood-red oval against the sleeve of my beige coat. The pressure was meant to be comforting. It felt like a brand. Elizabeth, darling, we are so sorry. She cooed, her voice dripping with a sympathy so thick it was suffocating. It must be some kind of computer glitch. A Mercury in retrograde thing, you know. She gave a little laugh, a tinkling sound that didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were sharp, calculating. They were already on the beach, a cocktail in hand. They were assessing me the obstacle and finding me successfully neutralized. I said nothing. For 45 years, my silence had been a currency Richard had demanded. He'd taught me that a quiet woman was a good woman, that opinions were unsightly, that needs were burdensome. I had been an expert in the art of becoming small, of fading into the wallpaper of my own life. It was a skill I had perfected, and now my own son was using that training against me. We can miss this flight, Mom David said, gesturing vaguely towards the gate. The partners. The conference is tomorrow morning. It is a non-negotiable. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, a gesture of performative stress I'd seen his father use 1,000 times. It was a tell, a mimicry of a man who felt nothing but ambition. We'll call you the second we land, Sarah promised, squeezing my arm again before letting go. We'll get this all sorted out. We'll book you on the next flight out first class, I promise. You just wait here, and we'll handle everything. They wouldn't. The lie was so audacious, so insultingly simple, it was almost elegant. The lost ticket. The computer glitch. The hurried dash through security, their carry-on bags rolling smoothly behind them, leaving me standing in their wake like a piece of forgotten luggage. I watched them go. David, my son, turning back for a fraction of a second, his face a mask of counterfeit regret. Sarah already on her phone, probably composing the Instagram post. Cheers, from the Cayman Islands. So sad Mom couldn't make it. Family. First. Almost. I could write the caption for her. I didn't feel sad. The emotion that rose in me was something colder, clearer. It was the feeling of a lens clicking into focus after a lifetime of blur. I was an inconvenience. Not a new revelation, but the method of disposal was new. So brazen. Richard, for all his cruelty, was a creature of control and appearances. He would never have sanctioned a scene in public. His abuse was a private, carefully curated affair. This was sloppy. This was David and Sarah. The agent behind the counter cleared her throat. Ma, is there anything else I can help you with? Her face was tired. She'd seen it all. Family dramas played out over baggage fees and boarding passes. No, I said. My voice came out steady, a surprise even to me. Thank you. Ivy changed my mind. I turned and walked away from the counter. I didn't look back. The sounds of the airport, once a chaotic symphony, now faded into a dull, distant roar. The announcements for final boarding calls, the laughter of families heading for vacation, the squeak of rolling suitcases, it all belonged to another world. I was a ghost here, a 75-year-old woman in a sensible coat, invisible. I walked past the overpriced shops selling Boston-themed sweatshirts and lobster-shaped chocolates. I walked past the bars filled with people having one last beer before their flight. I walked with a purpose I hadn't felt in months, not since Richard's funeral. Outside, the Boston air in late March was damp and cold. It bit at my cheeks. I hailed a taxi, the first one in the line. "Where to, lady?" the driver asked a young man with an easy smile. I gave him the address in Newton. The address of the house Richard had built, the house he had died in, the house that had been my prison for nearly half a century. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Coming from the airport or going to it?" "Coming from," I said, and a strange, cold smile touched my lips. There was a change of plans. The ride was quiet. The city blurred past the window, a smear of brick and glass and early spring trees. The driver tried to make small talk about the Red Sox, about the miserable weather. But my one-word answers eventually earned me the silence I craved. I wasn't thinking about David and Sarah anymore. I wasn't thinking about the Cayman Islands. I was thinking about the house. The house was waiting for me, a silent, hulking beast of grey stone and perfectly manicured lawns. It was Richard S. masterpiece, a monument to his success, his power, his impeccable taste. Every stone, every slate on the roof, every pane of glass had been chosen by him. I had just been chosen to live inside it. The taxi pulled into the long, curved driveway. I paid the driver, my hands steady, as I counted out the bills. He wished me a good day. I didn't reply. I stood on the flagstone path, my house key cold in my palm. For 6 months, since Richard S. Hart had finally given out in his sleep, the house had been mine. In name, at least. But his presence lingered. It was in the oppressive quiet, in the way the floorboards never dared to creak, in the scent of lemon oil and old paper that clung to the air. I unlocked the heavy oak door. The sound of the bolt sliding back echoed in the grand foyer. The silence inside was different from the silence in the taxi. This was an active silence, a watchful silence. It was the silence of a library where the librarian is a tyrant. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The click of the latch was deafening. I stood for a long moment in the marble-floored entryway, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the tall, narrow windows on either side of the door. The house smelled of Richard, clean, controlled, empty. I walked through the downstairs rooms, my sensible shoes making no sound on the thick, expensive rugs. Each room was a stage perfectly set, waiting for a play that had ended. The living room with its leather-bound books that no one ever read, arranged by colour on the shelves. The formal dining room where the table was always set for 12, though we hadn't hosted a dinner party in years. The long, polished mahogany surface reflected the crystal chandelier like a dark, still lake. Everything was immaculate, spotless, a testament to my 45 years of careful stewardship. My job had been to maintain the perfection, to be the curator of Richard S. Museum of a Life. I ran a hand along the back of a stiff velvet armchair. I had hated this chair. Richard had loved it. It remained. My steps led me as if by some old, ingrained habit toward his study. The door was closed. It had always been closed. That was his room, the one place in the house that was truly forbidden to me. I had only ever entered it to dust or to bring him a cup of tea, and only with his express permission. I stopped in the hallway, my hand hovering over the cold brass doorknob. But I didn't turn it. Not yet. Instead, a memory sharp and unwelcome, as a shard of glass, pierced the quiet. I was standing in this very hallway 2 years ago. Or was it 3? The years had a way of blurring together. Richard had called me from his study. His voice wasn't loud. It never was when he was truly angry. It was low, a cold, smooth threat. "Elizabeth." I had hurried to the doorway, my heart starting its familiar, frantic beat against my ribs. Yes, Richard. He was sitting behind his enormous desk, a leather-bound copy of Moby Dick in his hand. He hadn't looked at me. He had looked at the book, turning it over in his long, elegant fingers. This book, he said, his voice quiet. It was not on its shelf. It was on the side table. You know the rule. Everything has its place. I am sorry, Richard. I was reading it last night. I must have forgotten to put it back. He had finally lifted his eyes to meet mine. They were grey, like a winter storm over the ocean. You forgot, he repeated, not as a question, but as a judgment. You are forgetful, Elizabeth. Your mind is cluttered. A cluttered mind is an inefficient mind. It's a sign of weakness. We must not be weak. I had stood there, a woman of 73, feeling like a chastised child. I'll put it back right now. I'm sorry. No, he said, and he placed the book back on his desk with a soft, final thud. I have already rectified your mistake. But I want you to think about it. I want you to think about the importance of order, of discipline. The world is chaos, Elizabeth. Our home is not. Our home is a sanctuary of control. Do you understand? Yes, Richard, I had whispered. I understand. Now, standing in the same spot, the ghost of that humiliation felt fresh. That was his power. Not shouting, not hitting, just the slow, relentless erosion of the self until all that was left was a hollow shell that said, "Yes, Richard." The memory didn't make me weak. It solidified something inside me. The coldness I'd felt at the airport began to harden, to sharpen into a point. He had trained me to notice details, to see things out of place. He had, in his own monstrous way, made me a detective in my own home. And he had taught David, his son, his project. I turned away from the study and walked with a new, determined stride toward the kitchen. The kitchen was the heart of the house, but it was a cold one. All stainless steel and white marble chosen by an interior designer to Richard's specifications. It was efficient, sterile, and joyless. The silver garbage bin stood in the corner, gleaming under the recessed lighting. It had one of those fancy motion sensor lids. David had been so helpful back at the house before we'd left for the airport. "Mom, your purse is a mess," he'd said with a strained smile, a son trying to manage his doddering old mother. "Let's just clear out some of this old stuff. Receipts, tissues. It'll make it easier to find the ticket." He had stood right here by this counter and had tipped the contents of my handbag out. And then he had scooped up the handful of crumpled receipts and tissues and a napkin from the KFC we'd stopped at on the way, and he had dumped them into this bin. I pressed the manual open button. The lid hissed up. The smell of cold coffee grounds and yesterday's salad filled the air. On top of the pile, just as I knew it would be, was a crumpled, greasy napkin with the smiling face of Colonel Sanders. My hand didn't tremble as I reached in. I pushed aside a used tea bag and an empty yogurt container. My fingers brushed against a stiff rectangular piece of cardstock. I pulled it out. There it was. My ticket to Grand Cayman. Pristine, uncreased, the barcode unscanned. The seat assignment 14A clearly printed next to my name, Elizabeth Monroe. I held it in my hand. The physical proof. The undeniable evidence of the lie. This small piece of paper was their weapon, the tool they had used to discard me. A wave of something should have hit me then. Grief, rage, a torrent of tears for the son who would betray me so casually. For the 45 years I had wasted on a man who had taught my son that I was disposable, but I felt none of it. I looked at the ticket at my name printed in stark black letters, and I felt a profound, exhilarating calm. It was the calm of a general seeing the entire battlefield laid out before her. The calm of a chess player who finally understands her opponent's strategy. Richard had always said games were about control, about seeing 10 moves ahead. He had taught David how to play, but he had forgotten to teach him that I had been watching, always watching. The game had begun. And this time, I was going to be a player, not a piece on the board. I carefully folded the ticket and tucked it into the pocket of my coat. I let the lid of the garbage bin hiss shut. The sound was so final, so satisfying. The house was still silent, but it wasn't Richard's silence anymore. It was mine. I was standing there by the kitchen island, tracing the cold marble with my fingertips, when the silence was shattered. The shrill digital ring of my cell phone. It was a sound so alien in this house it made me jump. I rarely got calls. Who would be calling me? I fumbled in my purse, the one David had so helpfully organized. My phone was buried at the bottom. The screen lit up with a picture of a smiling young woman with bright purple streaks in her dark hair, sticking her tongue out at the camera. Chloe, my granddaughter. My sharp, witty 19-year-old Chloe, the only member of my family who had Richard S. intelligence but none of his cruelty. The only one I trusted. I swiped to answer my thumb unsteady for the first time that day. Hello, dear. Grandma Chloe S. voice was fast crackling with energy, a world away from the suffocating quiet of the house. Where are you? I just saw Dad S. Instagram story. Cheers from the Cayman Islands, with a stupid boomerang of their champagne glasses. I took a breath. I'm at home, Chloe. There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line. Not a confused silence, a knowing one. Chloe had been observing this family's dynamics her whole life. She was a quick study. At home. In Newton, she asked, her voice dropping the cheerful, bubbly tone. It was now sharp-focused. Weren't you supposed to be with them? There was a problem with my ticket, dear. I said, reciting the official story, wanting to hear how it sounded out loud. They couldn't find it in the system. David and Sarah were very upset, but they had to go for the conference. They are going to call me and sort it out. The silence that followed was heavy with skepticism. Then came a single explosive word. Bullshit. The bluntness of it, the sheer unadulterated certainty, was like a splash of cold water. I felt a laugh bubble up in my chest, a real one, the first in a long, long time. I had to stifle it. Chloe, your language, I chided, but there was no heat in it. Grandma Donty Chloe. Your language, me? She shot back her voice, a rapid-fire staccato of indignation. That is the laziest, most pathetic excuse I have ever heard. They did it on purpose. They left you at the airport. Oh my God, I'm going to kill them. I'm going to post their home address on a Taylor Swift fan forum and say they have extra tickets. I swear to God. The fierce, unconditional loyalty in her voice was a balm on a wound I hadn't even realized was open. It was validation. It was the proof that I wasn't crazy, that my cold analysis at the airport wasn't paranoia. It was the truth. I am all right, Chloe. Really, I said, and I was surprised to find that I meant it. I am fine. No, you're not fine. You were alone in that mausoleum of a house after your son, my father, who I am seriously reconsidering my genetic connection to, abandoned you at Logan. That's not fine. That's the beginning of a revenge movie. I smiled a genuine private smile. Perhaps it is. Okay? Chloe said, her tone shifting again. All business now. She was a student at NYU studying something complex with computers and code that I didn't fully understand, but I understood its power. Okay, so what's the plan? Because we have a plan. You and me? Team Grandma. What do you need? A plan, I repeated. The word felt foreign exciting. For decades, my life had been planned for me. Yes, a plan. They didn't just do this because they wanted a kid-free vacation. I mean, you're not exactly a wild party animal who's going to cramp their style, no offense. This was deliberate, calculated. Which means there's a reason, a big one. They wanted you out of that house and out of the way for a specific reason, so we need to find out what it is. Her logic was a straight, clean line through the fog of my thoughts. She was right. This wasn't just a cruel whim. The sloppiness of the execution at the airport belied a desperate, urgent motive. How would we do that? I asked, my mind racing. We dig, Chloe said, and I could almost hear her grin. Dad is a technological idiot. He uses the same password for everything, and it has been GoSox 1986 since I was in middle school. I know for a fact he and Sarah have a shared cloud account where they back up everything from their phones, photos, notes, documents, probably even their browser history. It is a digital treasure trove of terrible decisions. She paused, letting the possibility hang in the air. I can get in, Grandma, from my dorm room in New York. I can get into their digital lives. We can look at their finances, their emails, their recent Amazon purchases. People are so stupid about the tracks they leave online. We can find out what they re-hiding. The offer was astounding, a key to a locked room I never knew existed. For so long, I had been the one locked away. Now I was being handed the tools to do the locking. They wanted me gone. I said the words coming out low and clear. The question that had been forming in the back of my mind finally came to the forefront. It wasn't about the emotional pain of the betrayal anymore. That was an old familiar ache. This was something new. This was a puzzle. They wanted me gone so badly they were willing to risk this public spectacle. Why? What is in this house? What did Richard leave behind that they want so badly? My purpose, which had been a vague, nebulous feeling of defiance, now had a name. It was a hunt for the truth. Exactly. Chloe's voice was a whisper of conspiracy and excitement. So what do you say, Grandma? Are you in? I looked around the silent, sterile kitchen. I looked at the gleaming steel of the refrigerator, the dark, unblinking eye of the oven. This house had been my prison. But prisoners know their cells better than anyone. They know every crack in the wall, every loose floorboard, every secret whisper. Yes, Chloe. I said, my voice steady and firm, a voice I barely recognized as my own. I am in. The front of the ticket, the one David had so carelessly crumpled into the trash, was a shield. The back of it, the pristine, untorn side Elizabeth now held, was a sword. It was all the proof she needed, but it was only the beginning of the question. The real question wasn't if they had lied. It was why. The lie had to be so complete, so final. Why did they need her gone, not just for a week in the sun, but completely out of the picture? The answer she knew was not in the bright open spaces of the house she had been allowed to occupy. It was in the one space she had not. Richard's study. For 45 years, that door had remained closed to her. It was his sanctuary, his fortress. When he was alive, it was locked by his authority. After his death, it was locked by David, who inherited the keys as if they were a crown. But in his haste to stage his little drama at the airport, in his rush to get to the Caymans, David had been sloppy. After clearing out what he must have considered the most important of his father's papers, he hadn't bothered to turn the key. She stood before the door, now a slab of dark, imposing oak. It seemed to breathe, to emanate a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature of the house. For a moment, the old fear, the conditioned obedience of a lifetime whispered in her ear. You don't belong in there. That is not your place. She pushed the thought away. This whole house was her place now. She had paid for it with her silence, with her youth. She was done paying. Her hand, steady and resolute, closed around the cold brass knob. She turned it. The latch clicked a sound as loud as a gunshot in the silent hall. She pushed the door open. The air that hit her was stale, a preserved atmosphere of leather old paper and the ghost of expensive cigar smoke. It was the scent of Richard. The room was a monument to him. Dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling shelves groaning with leather-bound books that she knew for a fact he'd never read. They were props, just like the antique globe in the corner and the silver-framed photos on the mantelpiece Richard with grinning politicians. Richard on a boat, Richard accepting some award. A life curated for public consumption. An imposing desk, a vast expanse of polished oak, dominated the center of the room. It was neat, too neat. David had been here. But he had only taken the surface-level items, the things a son would be expected to clear out. The room's soul. Its secrets remained untouched. Elizabeth walked through it, not as a wife, but as an archaeologist entering a tomb. She wasn't looking for memories. She was looking for evidence. She ran a finger along a row of books. No dust. The cleaning service was meticulous. She moved to the desk, sat in the imposing leather chair that had always dwarfed her. It still felt like sitting on a throne built for a tyrant. She opened the drawers one by one. Pens, stationery embossed with Richard's initials, paper clips, nothing. It was all sterile, impersonal. It was as if the man's real life had been systematically scrubbed from his own inner sanctum. But that was a clue in itself. Richard was not a tidy man. He was a man of controlled chaos, of piles and notes, and half-finished thoughts left scattered like landmines. This was a performance, a stage set. She stood up and began to pace the perimeter of the room, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the thick Persian rug. Her eyes scanned every inch. The windows with their heavy velvet drapes. The fireplace swept clean. The shelves. Again the shelves. They drew her in. Hundreds of books, a wall of silent, unread words. She felt a growing frustration, a sense of being mocked by the room, see perfect, impenetrable facade. Then she saw it. It was almost nothing. At the edge of the rug, where the polished hardwood floor was exposed, just beside the base of the largest, most ornate bookshelf. She knelt her old knees, protesting, and looked closer. The light from the window caught it. A series of long, thin scratches in the dark wood of the floor. They were faint parallel, the kind of marks made by something heavy, being dragged not once, but many, many times back and forth over the same path. She ran her fingertips over them. The grooves were smooth, worn down by repetition. This bookshelf, a piece of furniture that looked as if it had been bolted to the foundation of the house, had been moved. Often, she tried to push it. It was solid, immovable. A wall of wood and paper weighing hundreds, maybe thousands of pounds. She was an old woman. She couldn't move it. But the scratches were there. They were a flaw in the story the room was trying to tell. A crack in the tomb. She stood up, brushing the dust from her knees. She couldn't move the shelf, but she was no longer working alone. She knew a way to bring in a wrecking ball. She pulled out her phone. The screen lit up her face in the dim light. She pressed the contact name Chloe. The phone rang twice before her granddaughter's face appeared bright and framed by the cheerful chaos of a college dorm room. A poster for some indie band was taped to the wall behind her. Grammy, is everything okay? Urian Dad, S. Study. Chloe S., eyes sharp and intelligent, were already taking in the background, analysing. Hello, dear. Elizabeth said, her voice calm, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. I need your help with something. Richard S. Computer. She turned the phone around to show Chloe the sleek silver iMac sitting dormant on the corner of the desk. A relic from a few years ago, but still a powerful machine. Chloe's brow furrowed slightly. Grandpa Richard S. iMac, didn't he, Dad? Say he wiped it. David said many things, Elizabeth replied, her tone dry. But he's been careless. The machine turns on, but it wants a password. Of course it does. Chloe sighed. Okay, let S try the easy stuff first. What was his pet S name? He hated animals. Okay, your birthday? Elizabeth typed it in. Password incorrect. My birthday. Password incorrect. David S. birthday. Password incorrect. The dog he had as a boy, Rexy or something. He ran away, Elizabeth said flatly. She typed it in anyway. Password incorrect. A grim smile touched Chloe's lips. Of course. Grandpa Richard wasn't the sentimental type. He wouldn't use a key that someone else could guess. He'd use a lock only he understood. Okay, Grammy, this is going to get a little more complicated. We were going to have to force our way in. Are you ready? I am ready, dear Elizabeth said. For the first time in days, a sliver of warmth entered her voice. This was her girl. Smart, fearless, her ally. For the next 20 minutes, Chloe, speaking from 100 miles away, became Elizabeth's hands. She guided her through a series of commands, her voice a steady, reassuring presence in the oppressive study. Okay, shut it down completely. Now hold down the Command and R keys. Keep holding them. Keep holding. Now press the power button. Dante, let go of the keys until you see the Apple logo. Elizabeth followed every instruction, her fingers once nimble on piano keys, now learning a new, more vital language. The screen flickered, changed, showed a menu she'd never seen before. Perfect, Chloe breathed. You in recovery mode. See the utilities menu at the top. Click on that. Now find terminal. A black box with a blinking white cursor appeared on the screen. It looked like a window into the machine S-brain. This is where we talk directly to the computer, Chloe explained. It's going to feel weird, but just type exactly what I tell you to. Type. Reset password, all one word, and hit enter. Elizabeth S. fingers hovered over the keyboard. She typed the command. A new window popped up, simple Stark. It asked her to select the user account Richard M. Thorne, and then offered her a box to enter a new password. It was that simple. So much power hidden behind a wall of jargon, a wall they had just walked through. He would have hated that Elizabeth murmured a ghost of a smile on her own lips, the idea that his fortress could be opened with a single word. He should have used better encryption, Chloe said, without a trace of sympathy. What do you want the new password to be? Elizabeth thought for a moment. Try freedom, she said. She typed it in. The computer accepted it. A moment later, Richard's desktop bloomed to life. It was as sterile as the rest of the room. A few neatly organized folders, finances, household, investments. Let S start with finances, Chloe said, her voice tight with anticipation. Elizabeth clicked. The folder opened. Inside were dozens of files, but each one had a little lock icon next to it. Encrypted, Chloe groaned. Damn it. He locked the individual files. I can break that from here, Grammy. That would take ages, maybe forever if he used military-grade stuff. A wave of disappointment washed over Elizabeth. So close, yet blocked again. So that, it then? No, wait. Chloe said, her eyes narrowed in thought. People get lazy. They encrypt the important stuff, but they forget about the breadcrumbs they leave behind. The day-to-day stuff. Go back. Close the folder. Dante, touch anything else. Just open his web browser. Elizabeth found the icon for the browser and clicked it. It opened to a blank home page. Okay, Chloe instructed at the top of the screen. Find the menu that says History. Click on it then. Show all history. The screen filled with a list, and suddenly the air in the room grew colder, the silence more profound. It was a diary of a secret life. Elizabeth read the entries aloud, her voice a low, steady monotone. Untraceable offshore banking, Cayman Islands, Swiss private banking laws, how to soundproof a basement, sound dampening foam panels bulk order, one-way security glass residential installation, best noise insulating materials 2023. Chloe was silent on the other end of the line, just listening. The list went on and on, a litany of paranoia and concealment. Grammy Chloe finally said, her voice hushed. This is This is more than just hiding money, I know, Elizabeth whispered. She kept scrolling back weeks, months, years. The searches were consistent, obsessive. Wait. Stop, Chloe said suddenly. Go back up. What was that file he had open last week? Elizabeth scrolled back to the top of the history, the most recently visited pages. One of them wasn't a web page. It was a local file on the computer itself. It was named Rose Care Schedule Texel SX. It is just his gardening spreadsheet, Elizabeth said, a note of exhaustion in her voice. He was obsessed with his prize-winning roses. Maybe, Chloe said slowly. But he looked at it right after searching for Cayman Islands bank transfers. That doesn't fit. Can you open it, please? Elizabeth found the file in the household folder and double-clicked. A spreadsheet opened, looking exactly like what it claimed to be. Columns for rose bush variety, watering schedule fertilizer, type date of pruning. It was meticulous. See, Elizabeth said. It is nothing. Wait, Grammy. Look at the numbers. The fertilizer amount column. They were huge. 50,000. 75,000. You don't use 75,000 grams of fertilizer on a rose bush. And look at the formulas. Click on one of those cells for me. Elizabeth clicked on a cell containing the number 50,000 nostalgus. The formula bar at the top of the screen didn't show a simple number. It showed a complex string of code referencing hidden cells and other worksheets. Using the spreadsheet as a mask, Chloe breathed her voice a mix of horror and awe. It's a ledger. Running calculations in the background and only displaying the final number. Hidden entire worksheets. Go to the View menu, click Unhide. Elizabeth did. A small box popped up. It listed 2 hidden sheets. Their names were Aletheia and Mnemosyne. Greek, Elizabeth whispered. Aletheia means truth. Mnemosyne is memory. Unhide them both, Chloe commanded, her voice sharp. Elizabeth clicked OK. 2 new tabs appeared at the bottom of the spreadsheet. She clicked on Aletheia. The screen filled with a dizzying array of columns. Dates, transaction codes, and 2 columns that made Elizabeth's blood run cold. Source account and destination account. The destination accounts were all numbers, but they were listed under the names of shell corporations. Aletheia Services Limited, Mnemosyne Holdings Inc., and next to them another column jurisdiction. Over and over, the same 2 words appeared: Cayman Islands. The payments were massive, regular. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing out month after month, year after year. A river of dark money disguised as fertilizer for roses. This wasn't just hiding money from the IRS. This was an operation. A fully fledged, long-term, multi-million-dollar operation. And David was now in the Cayman Islands, the nerve center of it all. The call with Chloe ended a few minutes later. Her granddaughter promised to start digging into the Shell Corporation names to see what she could unearth from her end. But as the screen went dark, Elizabeth was left alone in the suffocating silence of the study, the glowing ledger burning an afterimage onto her retinas. The digital evidence was a map, but it didn't show the territory. It showed the flow of money, but it didn't explain the soundproofing. It didn't explain the one-way glass. The 2 halves of the secret didn't fit. There was a piece missing, a human piece. Over the next day, she found herself tidying the study. Not cleaning, but searching with her hands. It was a nervous, restless energy, a need to touch the physical reality of Richard S. world, to find something he hadn't been able to digitize or encrypt. She dusted the books he never read, polished the silver frames of the men he'd used, straightened the papers he'd left as decoys. It was while she was wiping down the baseboards near the fireplace that she felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible puff of cold air against her knuckles. A draft. In a house built to be as solid and airtight as a bunker, a draft was an anomaly. Richard would never have tolerated it. She traced it to its source, a small rectangular heating vent set into the wall, low to the floor. She knelt down, her face close to the metal grill. The draft was real, a steady stream of cool, cellar-smelling air. Puzzled, she found a screwdriver in the desk drawer and carefully undid the two small screws holding the vent cover in place. She pulled it away. Inside was just a dark, dusty metal duct disappearing into the wall. Driven by an instinct she didn't understand, she reached her hand into the darkness. Her fingers brushed against cobwebs, dust, and then something else. Something small, hard, and metal. It was wedged deep inside, out of sight. Her fingers closed around it. She pulled it out. It was a microcassette recorder. Old, from the 90s, maybe. Black plastic, small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. It felt heavy, dense, with secrets. She looked at the tiny window on its face. There was a tape inside. Her heart began to pound a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. With trembling fingers, she found the play button. She pressed it. For a second, there was only the soft, mechanical whir of the tape turning, followed by a hiss of static. Then a voice. Richard S. voice. But it was a version of him she had never heard. It was stripped of all warmth, all pretense. It was flat, cold, clinical. The voice of a scientist observing a specimen. Subject compliance is paramount, David. You must learn to detach. Observe the emotional response, but do not share it. Empathy is a liability we cannot afford. The sanctity of the project depends on your discipline. Then another voice. Younger, thinner, trembling with a terror so profound it made the hairs on Elizabeth's arms stand up. It was David. A teenage David. But, Father? She was crying the whole time. I don't understand what she did wrong. She just answered the questions. A sigh of impatience from Richard, sharp and cruel on the cheap tape. What she did is irrelevant, David. Do you understand? She is not a person in that room. She is a variable. She is a problem to be solved. Her purpose is to provide a stress response. Your purpose is to learn how to calibrate that response, to heighten it, to control it. You are not there to be her friend. You are there to be her God. Now, report on session 4. What was the primary emotional trigger you identified? There was a long pause, filled only by the sound of David's ragged, terrified breathing. It was when you mentioned her son. David stammered. When you described what might happen to him if she failed to comply. Excellent, Richard's voice was laced with a chilling, predatory satisfaction. The familial bond. A primitive but exceptionally reliable lever. We will focus on that in the next session. You will lead the questioning this time. I will observe. No. David whispered the word, a tiny spark of rebellion. Father, please, I can tea. I don't want to. Richard's voice dropped, becoming a low, venomous hiss. You think you have a choice? You think this is a game? This is your inheritance, boy. This is your legacy. This is the work. You will learn it. You will master it. Or you will take her place in that chair. Is that clear? A choked sob from David. Yes, Father, good Richard said. The coldness was back. The sanctity of the project is absolute. The tape clicked off. The whirring stopped. Silence rushed back into the room, vast and horrifying. Elizabeth was on her knees, the recorder clutched in her hand. A wave of nausea washed over her. She scrambled to the wastebasket by the desk and was violently sick. The soundproofing, the one-way glass, the shell corporations, the project. It all crashed together in her mind, forming a picture of unimaginable monstrosity. Richard hadn't just been a controlling husband or a financial criminal. He was a monster. He had run some kind of facility, some kind of laboratory for psychological torture, and the money flowing to the Caymans wasn't a just profit. It was payment. Payment for Alethea Services for truth, for Mnemosyne Holdings for memory. People paid him for this. And David, her son. He wasn't just a greedy accomplice who wanted her money. He was his father's first victim. His father's greatest creation. Forged in terror, trained to continue the work. The trip to the Cayman Islands. It wasn't a vacation. It wasn't even just a business trip to manage the money. He was going there to conduct a session. He was continuing his father's work. The project was still alive, the world tilted on its axis. The woman she had been, the life she had lived, the man she had been married to, the son she had raised, all of it was a lie. A carefully constructed cage. And she had lived inside it for 50 years without ever seeing the bars. The next 2 days passed in a fog of horror. Elizabeth barely ate or slept. She sat in the dark study, the small recorder on the desk in front of her like a malevolent idol, its contents poisoning the air. What could she do? Go to the police. With what a scratch on the floor, a confusing spreadsheet, an old tape of a dead man bullying his son. They would think she was a crazy, grieving old woman. They would pat her on the head and send her home with a pamphlet for a therapist. She had to find more. She had to find the sessions, the proof. On the third morning, the doorbell rang. The sound was sharp, aggressive, slicing through the funereal quiet of the house. It wasn't the mailman's usual quick chime. It was a prolonged, insistent buzz. Elizabeth's heart clenched. Slowly, she made her way to the door. Through the peephole, she saw a courier, a man in a crisp uniform holding a clipboard and a stiff, oversized envelope. She opened the door a crack. Registered mail for Elizabeth Thorne, he said, not meeting her eyes. Signature required. She signed the electronic pad with a hand that shook slightly. He handed her the envelope and walked away. It was heavy, made of thick, creamy paper that felt expensive and important. In the top left corner, an embossed logo, Blackwood, Coyle and Finch, attorneys at law. One of Boston's oldest and most powerful law firms, Richard S. Firm, now David S. She walked back to the kitchen, her feet feeling like lead. She slit the envelope open with a butter knife. She pulled out the single heavy sheet of paper inside. The words, printed in a severe, formal font, seemed to leap off the page. Dear Mrs. Thorne, this letter is to inform you that a petition has been filed with the Suffolk County Probate and Family Court by your son, Mr. David Thorne. The petition is for an emergency temporary conservatorship over your person and your estate. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. She read on, her eyes flying across the page. The petition cites as cause your recent and alarming episode of confusion and paranoia at Logan International Airport, as witnessed by your son and daughter-in-law. It further attests to a pattern of cognitive decline and an increasing inability to manage your own personal and financial affairs, putting your well-being and your assets at significant risk. The lies, so clinical, so official. They had twisted her moment of dawning clarity into a symptom of madness. They were using her age as a weapon. The petition seeks to have you declared mentally unfit to make your own decisions. It requests that the court grant full legal authority to your son, Mr. David Thorne, to act on your behalf in all matters. The words blurred. They were trying to erase her, to strip her of her voice, her rights, her very self, to make her a non-person legally and completely. And then the final brutal paragraph, the checkmate. A hearing on this matter has been scheduled before the Honourable Judge Eleanor Vance. The hearing will take place at 10:00 a.m. on October 26th. She looked at the calendar on the wall. Today was October 12th. They had given her 2 weeks. 2 weeks to fight back, before they could have her locked away, medicated, silenced. 2 weeks to uncover a lifetime of monstrous secrets before they could legally bury her with them. The trap had been sprung. The cage door was swinging shut, and Elizabeth stood in the middle of her silent, predatory house, holding the letter that was meant to be her death warrant. A cold, clear fury, unlike anything she had ever known, rose up inside her, burning away the fog of horror and despair. This was not a search for truth anymore. This was a war for survival. And she had just been told the clock was ticking. The sound from the micro-cassette player was a ghost in the room, a thin, reedy echo of Richard's voice that coiled around the silence in his study. The words still hung in the air, cold and clinical. Viewing room, subject compliance, the sanctity of the project. They weren't just words anymore. They were keys. Elizabeth stood in the center of the room, the place she had been forbidden to stand for 45 years, and her gaze fell upon the enormous dark wood bookshelf. It dominated the wall, filled with leather-bound volumes that Richard had called the cornerstones of a civilized mind. He'd never read them. She knew, because the dust on their tops had been undisturbed for decades. But he liked how they looked. He liked the authority they projected. Her eyes weren't E.T. on the books, but on the floor, just as she remembered from her brief, panicked search earlier. Near the right-hand side of the massive piece of furniture, the polished oak floorboards were marred. Not with a single scratch, but with a series of fine parallel lines, as if something incredibly heavy had been dragged back and forth again and again by someone trying to be careful, but failing over time. The viewing room. It wasn't somewhere else in the house. It was here. It was part of this. She walked over her soft-soled slippers, making no sound. She ran her fingers over the spines of the books on the third shelf. They felt wrong. The leather was too smooth, too perfect. It didn't have the worn, supple feel of real, aged bindings. She hooked a finger behind one, a handsome copy of The Wealth of Nations, and pulled. It didn't move like a book. It came away in her hand with a hollow plastic lightness. It was just a spine, a facade. Behind it was not a shelf, but a flat, dark panel. She pulled another and another. A whole row of them, a dozen fake books, came away to reveal a single, seamless piece of wood. And in the center of that panel, flush-mounted and barely visible, was a small, square, numeric keypad. Her breath hitched. For a moment, the sheer, calculated deceit of it all washed over her. The fake books, the hidden panel. A secret kept in plain sight, protected by his authority and her obedience. He had built a fortress inside his own home, and she had dusted its walls. The keypad stared back at her. A code. What would it be? Richard was a man of monumental ego, but also of meticulous caution. It wouldn't be his own birthday or hers or David S. Too obvious, too sentimental, and he despised sentiment. Her mind raced back to the tinny audio from the tape. He had been reviewing a session, a difficult one. Subject 37, Eleanor Vance. The breakthrough was elusive, and then, almost as an aside, a detail meant for his own records. A shame. The upcoming anniversary of her birth would have been a perfect leverage point. June 10th, 1982. It was a monstrous thought. To use a victimess birth date as the key to their prison. It was exactly the kind of cruel, poetic detail Richard would have savoured. Her hands were trembling, not with fear, but with a cold, surging adrenaline. She looked at the keypad. June 10th, 1982. 6 digits. 061082. She pictured the numbers in her mind, steadied her hand against the shelf, and began to press the keys. Each press was soft, yielding the plastic, giving a faint click. 061082. For a second, nothing happened. A wave of disappointment, sharp and bitter, washed over her. Had she been wrong? Was it all just a dead end, another one of his pointless games? But then not a loud noise, but a deep, resonant thunk echoed from within the wall. It was the sound of a heavy bolt sliding home. A faint crack of darkness appeared along the right-hand side of the entire bookshelf unit. She pushed gently at first, then with more force. The entire massive structure swung inward with a low, groaning protest of old hinges, revealing not a wall, but a void. A narrow, dark staircase descended into blackness. The air that flowed out to meet her was not the air of the house. It was ancient, stale, and unnaturally cold, carrying the faint metallic scent of electronics and the damp, earthy smell of a cellar that had never been allowed to breathe. It was the smell of a tomb. Elizabeth stood at the precipice, looking down into the throat of her husband's secret world. She did not hesitate. Taking a deep breath of the stale, cold air, she took the first step down. The stairs were steep and concrete, the walls on either side bare and cold to the touch. The heavy bookshelf swung shut behind her with another deep thud, plunging her into absolute darkness. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at her for a heartbeat, before her hand, searching the wall, found a switch. She flicked it. A single bare bulb, far below, flickered to life, casting long, distorted shadows up the stairwell. It was enough. She continued her descent, her hand trailing along the rough concrete each step, taking her further away from the sunlit world she knew and deeper into the truth she had lived beside for nearly half a century. The stairs ended in a small concrete landing facing a heavy, soundproofed door, the kind you'd see in a recording studio. It had a small, thick-paned window at eye level. This was it, the viewing room. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. With a final steadying breath, she turned the industrial steel handle and pushed the door open. The room was just as the tape had implied. It was small, cramped, and clinical. The first thing she saw was the mirror. A massive one-way mirror dominated the far wall, a dark, reflective sheet of glass that promised a view into another space. In front of it sat a single worn leather armchair. The leather was cracked and faded in the shape of a man's body, the permanent impression of the person who had sat there for countless hours, watching. To the right of the chair was a bank of electronic equipment. Old high-end VCRs, audio mixers, and stacks of recording decks, all connected by a tangled serpent's nest of cables. A fine layer of dust covered everything, but it was the clean, settled dust of disuse, not the thick grime of neglect. This place had been abandoned, but not dismantled. Her eyes scanned the room, and the true horror began to reveal itself. It wasn't in the chair or the machines. It was on the walls. Lining the other two walls from floor to ceiling were simple industrial metal shelves, and on those shelves, packed tight, were hundreds upon hundreds of VHS tapes. Each one was stored in a plain white cardboard sleeve, its spine meticulously labelled in Richard's sharp, aggressive handwriting. The labels were simple, a date and a session number. The dates stretched back decades: 1985, 1992, 2003, 2015. It was a library of pain, a catalogue of broken lives. Beneath the shelves of tapes were filing cabinets. She pulled open the top drawer of the one nearest to her. It wasn't locked. Inside were not files, but thick, leather-bound ledgers. She lifted one out. It was heavy, substantial. The cover was embossed with a single word: clients. She opened it. The pages were filled with the same precise handwriting. Names. Prestigious, recognizable names from the worlds of finance, politics, and industry. Beside each name were dates and figures, enormous sums of money listed as dues or sponsorships. She put it back her fingers, feeling numb and disconnected from her body. She pulled out another ledger. This one was labelled Subjects. She opened it to a random page. Here the entries were different. Names, yes, but these were people she'd never heard of. Vulnerable people, she now realized. People Richard had somehow identified and lured here. Beside each name were notes. Cold, detached, analytical notes. Initial resistance high. Leveraged childhood trauma for compliance. Subject exhibits classic attachment-seeking behavior post-session. Session concluded with satisfactory emotional collapse. It was a business, a sick secret club for the powerful and depraved. Richard hadn't just been a domestic tyrant. He had been a monster for hire. He had built a stage, and for the right price, the titans of the world could buy a front-row seat to watch him psychologically dissect and destroy human beings under the guise of some twisted experimental therapy. The money, the offshore accounts, Chloe had found it all clicked into place. This was the source of their wealth. This was the foundation upon which their entire life had been built. A foundation of calculated cruelty. She felt a wave of nausea so profound she had to brace herself against the filing cabinet. She had slept next to this man. She had raised a son with him. She had spent her life enabling a monster without ever knowing the true depths of the abyss he inhabited. All the pieces were there. His obsession with control, his chillingly detached view of human emotion, his private study, his unexplained wealth. She had seen the symptoms, but she had never ever imagined the disease was this malignant. Her gaze drifted back to the shelves of tapes, a vast, silent chorus of suffering. She walked along them, her fingers tracing the dates. So many years. So many people. She was about to turn away, unable to bear it any longer, when her eyes caught a detail on a tape from about 15 years ago. The label was different from the others. The ink was slightly faded, the handwriting a little less steady, as if written in a moment of high emotion. It didn't have an unfamiliar name. It had a title. Session 144, The Sun. The air left her lungs in a single, silent gasp. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. Her mind screamed denial, but her body was already moving. Her hands, shaking so violently she could barely control them, reached for the tape. She pulled it from the shelf. The cardboard sleeve felt impossibly heavy. The sun. There was only one son. Her son. David. She looked at the VCR deck. It was still plugged in. An old tape, some forgotten session, was still inside. With robotic movements, she pressed the eject button. The machine whirred and spat out the old cassette. She stared at the tape in her hand. Session 144. The Sun. To watch it felt like an unforgivable violation. To not watch it felt like a cowardice she could no longer afford. She had to know. She had to understand the full scope of what had happened in this house. She slid the tape into the VCR. The machine swallowed it with a loud clack. She found the corresponding monitor, its screen dark and dusty, and switched it on. It flickered to life with a hum, bathing the dark room in a pale blue-white glow. She picked up the remote, her thumb hovering over the play button. She was no longer just an explorer of this dungeon. She was about to become a spectator, just like Richard's wealthy clients. The thought made her feel sick. Steeling herself, she pressed play. The image that appeared on the screen was grainy shot from a fixed high angle. It was the room next door, the one behind the one-way mirror. It was sparsely furnished, just as she'd imagined a twisted therapist's office would be. There were no couches, only two hard-backed chairs facing each other. Richard was in one, looking younger, his face impassive, clinical. And in the other chair was David. He was a boy. Not a man, but a boy on the cusp of it, maybe 16 or 17. His face was pale, tear-streaked, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. He was weeping not loudly, but with the quiet, helpless sobs of a child who knows there is no escape. Richard's voice came through the monitor's speakers, calm and devoid of any paternal warmth. "We've been over this, David. Emotion is a weakness. It is a vulnerability to be exploited, not indulged. You must learn to see it as a tool, in others and in yourself." "Please, Dad," the boy on the screen whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't. Please don't make me. Make you," what Richard's voice was like ice. "Make you strong. Make you worthy of what we are building. This is not a punishment. This is your education. Our clients are watching. They are learning from me, and you are learning from me. This is the most important lesson you will ever receive." Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a cry that was half gasp, half sob. The clients. They were watching. They had paid to watch her husband torment their own son. This wasn't just a session. It was an initiation, a baptism by fire. David wasn't just an accomplice who had been taught the family business. He was its first product, its primary victim. Richard hadn't just groomed him. He had broken him piece by piece in this cold, dark room, and then rebuilt him in his own monstrous image. She watched for another minute, her heart shattering with every frame. She watched Richard calmly dismantle his own son's spirit, using the boy's fears, his hopes, his love for his own father as weapons against him. He was teaching David how to become a predator by first making him the prey. Elizabeth hit stop. The screen went blue. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavier, more profound than before. She finally understood. She understood David's weakness, his desperate need for his father's approval, his inability to stand up to him, and now his grim determination to continue the project in the Cayman Islands. He wasn't just continuing a legacy to gain wealth or power. He was acting out the deepest, most terrifying lesson of his life, that this was the only way to be worthy, the only way to survive. The cage he was trying to lock her in was a gilded copy of the one his own father had built for him years ago. He was not just a villain, he was a tragedy. A new feeling settled over her, displacing the shock and the horror. It was a terrible, aching clarity. It was the cold, hard resolve of a woman who had just seen the absolute truth. Her fight was not just for herself anymore. It was for the boy on that tape. It was to burn down the whole rotten structure from the foundation to the roof. She stood up, ejected the tape, and placed it carefully, reverently into the pocket of her housecoat. She then walked back to the filing cabinets. She didn't need all the ledgers, just one. She chose the most recent client ledger, the one detailing the current flow of money. She took one of the empty banker's boxes that were stacked in a corner, placed the heavy ledger inside, and walked out of the viewing room, leaving the door ajar. She didn't look back. As she ascended the stairs, she didn't feel the cold or the darkness. She felt only the weight of the ledger in the box and the small, hard square of the VHS tape in her pocket. A few days later, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the suffocating silence of the house. Elizabeth was in the living room waiting. She had been waiting for hours. The house was clean, unnaturally so. She had spent the time erasing any sign of her discovery, but not the evidence itself. The banker's box sat on the coffee table in front of her. Inside was the ledger. The microcassette player was on the mantelpiece, silent. The television was on, but the sound was muted, its screen playing a generic nature documentary showing sharks gliding through a coral reef. The front door opened. "We home." Sarah's voice was bright, triumphant, and utterly false. It echoed in the grand foyer. David's voice was more subdued, a low murmur. Elizabeth heard the clatter of suitcases being dropped on the marble floor, the rustle of bags from duty-free. They were tanned, glowing with the smug satisfaction of a successful trip. They had met with Richard S. Associates. They had secured the network. The money would continue to flow. Their future was assured. They walked into the living room and stopped. They had been expecting to find her where they left her, a confused, defeated old woman, perhaps weeping in an armchair ready to be managed, ready for the psychiatric evaluations and the legal proceedings that would strip her of her autonomy. Instead, they found this. Elizabeth sitting perfectly upright on the sofa, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were clear, steady, and held a chilling lack of emotion. She looked at them not as a mother, but as a stranger, an observer. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the television. Mother David said, his voice laced with caution. He took a step forward. You here. Sarah, ever the actress, plastered a look of strained concern on her face. Elizabeth, my God. We were so worried. We tried calling. Are you all right? You look pale. She glanced around the room, her eyes flicking towards the muted TV, the box on the table. She sensed that the scene was wrong, that the script she had prepared in her head was useless. David and Sarah stood there, framed in the doorway, their expensive resort wear, looking absurdly out of place in the tense, sterile atmosphere of the room. Their confident, triumphant energy seemed to evaporate, absorbed by the unnerving calm of the woman on the couch. They thought they were the predators returning to the den to find their prey weakened. They were wrong. They had walked into a trap, and the bait was the very woman they had sought to destroy. Elizabeth let the silence stretch, letting them absorb the wrongness of the scene. She watched them, her expression unreadable. She let their confidence curdle into confusion, and then into a nascent, prickling fear. The performance was about to begin, and she was the director. How was the Cayman Islands? Elizabeth's voice was quiet, conversational. It cut through the tension like a knife. Sarah recovered, first launching into the performance she'd rehearsed. Oh, it was a necessary trip, Elizabeth. Difficult. We were settling some of your affairs, Richard S. old investments. So complicated. We were worried sick about you the whole time, of course. That scene at the airport, it gave us such a fright. She took a step closer, her voice dripping with manufactured sympathy. David has been beside himself. David just stood there, his tan doing nothing to hide the pallor spreading beneath his skin. He was watching his mother, and for the first time he seemed to be truly seeing the woman in front of him, not the docile figure from his childhood. And he didn't like what he saw. Elizabeth let Sarah's words hang in the air for a moment, letting the lies dissolve. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply leaned forward, her movements slow and deliberate. I see. She reached for the Banker S-box. The sound of the cardboard lid sliding off was unnaturally loud in the silent room. She reached inside and pulled out the thick, leather-bound ledger. She placed it on the coffee table between them with a soft, heavy thud. Thud. It was the only sound. David froze. His eyes locked onto the book. He recognized it. Of course he recognized it. It was a part of the architecture of his life, a sacred text from his father's private religion. His face, already pale, turned the color of ash. His breath caught in his throat. Sarah, however, saw only an old book. Her condescension returned in a rush. What is that? She scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. More of Richard S. old junk? Elizabeth, honestly, we need to talk about what is going to happen now. For your own good. David has already spoken with a lawyer. Be quiet, Sarah, Elizabeth said. The command was spoken so softly it was almost a whisper, yet it cracked through the air with the force of a whip. Sarah stopped, her mouth half open, stunned into silence. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Certainly not Elizabeth. Elizabeth's gaze remained fixed on her son. "This isn't a junk, is it, David?" she asked, her voice still quiet, still terrifyingly calm. David couldn't speak. He could only stare at the ledger, his mind clearly racing, trying to calculate how this was possible, how she could have found it, the study, the lock, the code. It was impossible. Elizabeth didn't wait for an answer. She picked up the remote for the small cassette player on the mantelpiece. With a single, deliberate press of a button, she turned the room's silence into a living nightmare. Richard's voice filled the space. It wasn't shouting. It was his calm, instructional tone, the one from the tape she'd found in the vent, the one she now knew he used with his clients and with his son. The key is to dismantle their sense of self. The reedy voice from the past explained. You isolate them. You become their only point of reference for reality. It is about control, absolute control. That is the service we provide. That is the sanctity of the project. The effect on David was instantaneous and catastrophic. It was as if Richard's voice had reached out from the grave and severed the strings holding him together. A choked, guttural sound escaped his lips. His legs gave out, and he didn't just sit. He physically collapsed into the armchair behind him, his body folding in on itself. He buried his face in his hands, and his shoulders began to shake with deep, racking sobs. Not the tears of a man, but the helpless, broken sobs of the boy in the chair from session 144. Sarah stared at her husband, then at Elizabeth, her face a mask of furious confusion. The mask began to crack. "What is this? What have you done?" she hissed. The carefully constructed facade of the sophisticated, caring daughter-in-law was crumbling, revealing the greedy, vicious core beneath. Turn it off. Seeing the ledger, seeing her husband fall apart, she finally understood. Not the whole truth, but enough. She knew what that book represented. She knew it was the source of the money, and she saw it all slipping away. Panic, raw and ugly, took over. "You senile old bitch!" she shrieked, her voice high and shrill. She lunged not for David, but for the box on the table. She was going for the evidence. "You will ruin everything, everything. Do you have any idea what this is? This is our future, his legacy. You were supposed to be in a home by now. You were supposed to be declared incompetent." Her hand clawed at the edge of the Banker S box, her manicured nails scraping against the cardboard. It was a confession, a full, screaming confession of her knowledge, her complicity, her intent. She admitted to everything in a torrent of greed and fury. "We worked for this. I put up with him." She jabbed a finger at the sobbing form of David, with his weakness, for this. "I earned this. You will not take it from me." But as her fingers were about to close around the ledger, a sound cut through her tirade. Or ding-dong, the doorbell, sharp, clear, and insistent. Sarah froze her hand, hovering over the box. She looked towards the front door, then back at Elizabeth, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. Ding-dong. It rang again, more forcefully this time. And then again. And again. A steady, rhythmic, unavoidable summons. Elizabeth didn't move from the sofa. She looked at Sarah, the first flicker of something other than cold calm in her eyes. It was a look of finality, a look of judgment. "I believe they have a warrant, Sarah," she said, her voice returning to its devastating quiet. "I believe it S for you." The officer, a man whose face was too young for the weariness in his eyes, knelt slightly to be on Elizabeth's level. Behind him, another officer was trying to manage a shrieking Sarah, who was clawing at the fine silk curtains by the door. Her carefully constructed mask of suburban grace shredded into something primitive and ugly. "Ma'am," the young officer said, his voice a calm island in the storm of Sarah's hysterics. "My name is Officer Miller. Can you tell me what happened here?" David was a statue, carved from ash, standing near the fireplace, his eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance, seeing nothing in the room, perhaps seeing everything he had ever done. He hadn't moved since the front door had been breached by the sharp, authoritative knock. Elizabeth looked at the officer, her gaze steady, clear. There was no tremor in her hands, no fear in her voice. My daughter-in-law, Sarah, became agitated. She believes I am unwell. In her agitation, she assaulted me. She gestured with her chin toward the hallway. I believe her exact words before she shoved me were about taking control of what was rightfully hers. It was quite illuminating. She's lying. She's a senile old woman. She's delusional. Sarah's voice was a ragged saw cutting through the air. Check the court filings. We have a hearing for conservatorship. She's incompetent. She's trying to ruin us. Officer Miller didn't look away from Elizabeth. He had seen hysterics before. He had seen greed. He had also seen the strange, chilling calm that often accompanies the truth. We received a package, ma'am, an anonymous tip. It contained materials, audio files, ledgers, a very detailed letter. He paused. It instructed us to come to this address at this exact time. It said we would find corroboration. Elizabeth gave a slow, deliberate nod. Ah, that would be from my granddaughter. She is a very resourceful young woman. The other officer finally had Sarah in cuffs. The fight seemed to drain out of her, instantly replaced by a venomous, stunned silence. She stared at Elizabeth, her eyes promising 1,000 different kinds of revenge, none of which she would ever be in a position to deliver. "You will burn for this, you old witch." She hissed the words, small and pathetic, as they led her out into the flashing blue and red lights that painted the manicured lawn in strokes of lurid color. The house fell silent, all except for the faint, rhythmic ticking of the grand father clock in the hall, a sound Elizabeth had hated for 45 years. Each tick a measure of her stolen life. Officer Miller stood up. His gaze shifted to the ghost by the fireplace. "So, Mr. Gardner, we're going to need you to come down to the station. We have a lot of questions." David didn't respond. He didn't even blink. He looked like a man who had already been pronounced dead, but whose body hadn't yet received the news. Elizabeth held up a hand, not a plea, but a command. "Officer," she said, her voice soft but immovable. "Give me 5 minutes with my son. Please? He won't be going anywhere, I promise you." The officer hesitated, looking from Elizabeth's resolute face to David's empty shell. Protocol screamed no. But some deeper instinct, some recognition of the gravity of the moment, made him nod. "5 minutes, ma'am. We'll be right outside." The front door clicked shut, leaving Elizabeth and David alone in the cavernous living room. The flashing lights still swept across the walls, a silent, frantic pulse. The air was thick with ruin. Elizabeth walked over to the heavy oak table where she had left the small cassette tape. She picked it up, her fingers closing around the cheap plastic. She looked at her son, her creation, her betrayer, her victim. The rage was gone. The hurt had burned itself out, leaving behind something harder, cleaner. What was left was the cold, unburnable ash of purpose. "They know David," she said. Her voice wasn't accusatory. It was a simple statement of fact, like commenting on the weather. "Chloe sent them everything. The ledgers from your father's computer. The recordings from the vent. They have the proof of the shell corporations. They know about the Cayman accounts. They know the club was not a fiction. They are not here because Sarah pushed me. They are here because your father built a cathedral of pain, and you were his loyal acolyte." David's head finally moved, a slow, painful turn to face her. His face was a mess of confusion and terror. "Mother." He whispered the word, a tiny, lost sound. "Don't." She said the single word sharp enough to make him flinch. "Do not use that word." That word implies a bond, a trust. You burned that bridge when you left me at the airport. You ground the ashes into the dirt when you filed that petition to have me declared insane. A woman whose only madness was believing for a time that her son possessed a spine. She walked toward him, stopping a few feet away. She held up the cassette. The label written in Richard's precise, arrogant hand was visible in the dim light. Session 144, The Sun. They don't have this one, though, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Chloe was very specific in her instructions. This one was for me. I listened to it, David. I sat in your father's forbidden office, and I listened to him break you. I listened to him forge you into a weapon, a tool. I heard you cry. I heard you beg. And then I heard you stop. A tremor went through David. A deep, violent shudder that started in his feet and racked his entire body. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat, the sound of an animal caught in a trap. He made you his first victim. Elizabeth continued, her voice relentless, stripping away every lie he had ever told himself. And then he made you his accomplice. A perfect cruelty. He bound you to him not with love, but with shared sin. He made you believe his sickness was your inheritance, his darkness your destiny. She saw it then, the complete and total collapse of the man. His knees buckled, and he slid down the wall, landing in a heap on the expensive Persian rug. He curled into a ball, his hands over his head, and he began to sob. Not the dignified tears of a man in grief, but the wrenching, soul-tearing howls of a child who has just understood the monster under his bed is real, and it has been sleeping next to him his entire life. Elizabeth watched him, her face impassive. She felt no pity. Pity was a feeling for people who had options. David had been stripped of his one by one over a lifetime of meticulous cruelty, and now she was going to give him one back. Just one. She crouched down, not to comfort him, but to ensure he heard every single word. She placed the cassette tape on the floor in front of him, a small, dark offering. This is not about forgiveness, David. Forgiveness is a luxury neither of us can afford. And it is certainly not about saving you. You will go to prison. You will pay for what you helped him do. This is about something else. This is about control. He looked up, his face slick with tears and snot, his eyes wide with a terror that was profoundly childish. I am giving you a choice, she said, her voice as cold and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. It is the first real choice you have ever been allowed to make. So I suggest you listen very, very carefully. She pointed to the tape. Option 1. You walk out that door and you tell the police everything. You become the state's key witness. You use your intimate knowledge of your father's network to help them dismantle it piece by bloody piece. You will give them the names of every client. You will help them locate every victim whose life was shattered in that basement. You will expose the entire rot from the roots up. Your life, as you know it, is over. You will be a pariah. But you will be the instrument of justice. You will, in some small, miserable way, begin to undo the evil you helped create. It is a sliver of redemption. A tiny, pathetic sliver. But it is something. She paused, letting the words sink into the ruined landscape of his mind. Then she tapped the cassette. Or there is option 2. You say nothing. You let the lawyers handle it. And I will ensure this tape is leaked to every major news network on the planet. I will release Session 144. The world will not see you as a monster's accomplice. They will see you as a broken toy. They will hear your father mock your tears. They will hear him turn you. They will not prosecute you with the same vigor. They will pity you. Your name will not be a synonym for evil, but for pathetic, humiliating weakness. Every person you ever meet for the rest of your life will know how your father unmade you. You will be infamous, not for your crimes, but for your debasement. She stood up, towering over his crumpled form. So you see the choice, David. It is not between prison and freedom. It is between who you will be while you are paying for your sins. Will you be the man who helped burn down the evil empire from the inside, or the sniveling boy whose torment becomes a global headline, a footnote of redemption, or a lifetime of utter public shame? The choice is yours. It is the only thing that is. She turned and walked back to the armchair, sitting down to wait. The clock in the hall ticked. The flashing lights outside painted the room in silence. David's ragged sobs slowly subsided, replaced by a thick, heavy quiet. Minutes stretched into an eternity. She could hear the muffled sounds of the officers on the porch waiting. Finally, she heard a rustle. David was getting to his feet. He was unsteady, like a newborn colt. He wiped his face on the sleeve of his expensive cashmere sweater. He did not look at her. He looked at the front door. He took one step, then another. His hand reached the doorknob. He stopped his back to her. "I'll do it." He whispered the words barely audible. "I'll talk." Elizabeth did not reply. She simply closed her eyes, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, took a deep, steadying breath. The game was over. She had won. The months that followed were a blur of organized chaos, a methodical firestorm Elizabeth directed with the dispassionate focus of a CEO overseeing a hostile takeover. David, true to his word, became the state's most valuable asset. The case of the Newton basement became a national obsession, a grotesque horror story that peeled back the skin of elite suburban respectability to reveal a writhing mass of corruption beneath. David, gaunt and hollowed out, sat for endless depositions, his voice a monotone drone as he unspooled 30 years of secrets. Names were named. Powerful, untouchable men, CEOs, judges, politicians, were suddenly very, very touchable. Reputations built over generations crumbled into dust overnight. The Gardner name, once a synonym for old money and quiet influence, was now permanently welded to a story of monstrous depravity. It was a brand of infamy that could never be washed clean. The petition for conservatorship was dismissed, with a scathing rebuke from the judge a footnote in the larger, more sordid story. Elizabeth was officially and legally her own woman, and she moved like one. She hired a team of forensic accountants and lawyers, not the smiling, obsequious men Richard had kept on retainer, but sharp, hungry sharks who specialized in dismantling complex financial empires. They were bewildered by her. This quiet, 75-year-old woman in a simple cardigan who spoke of offshore accounts and shell corporations with the flat authority of a seasoned criminal. She worked from the dining room table, the same table where she had been ignored for decades. Now it was her war room, covered in financial statements, legal documents, and asset inventories. She was relentless. Every stock, every bond, every piece of art Richard had purchased with his blood money was identified, liquidated, and quarantined. She was separating the clean from the tainted, the life she had brought into the marriage from the death he had cultivated within it. She sold everything: the vacation home in the Hamptons, the art collection filled with soulless abstracts Richard had bought as investments, the fleet of classic cars rusting in a climate-controlled garage. Each sale was a snip of a thread, severing her from the life that had been a lie. The final act, the only one that truly mattered, was the house. She found a developer, a man with a bulldog jaw and no sentimentality, who saw the sprawling Newton property not as a home, but as a teardown, a prime lot for 4 smaller, soulless McMansions. He offered her a fair price. She accepted without negotiation. On the day of the demolition, she didn't have to be there. Her lawyer advised against it. But she went. She parked her modest new sedan across the street and sat in the driver's seat, the window down. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth. The house looked smaller somehow. pathetic. Stripped of its expensive furniture and art, it was just a box of wood plaster and bad memories. A crowd hadn't gathered. The story was already fading from the news cycle, replaced by newer, fresher scandals. There was just her, the demolition crew, and the great yellow beast of the wrecking ball. The machine coughed to life a diesel roar that shattered the morning quiet. The arm lifted, swinging the huge iron sphere in a slow, graceful arc. For a moment, it hung suspended at its apex, a black sun against the pale sky. Then it fell. It struck the side of the house right where the formal living room had been. The wall imploded. Plaster dust plumed into the air like a ghost escaping. There was a sound of splintering wood, of groaning support beams, a sound of finality. The wrecking ball swung back and hit again this time, punching through the master bedroom, her gilded cage for 45 years. She watched it all. She watched the machine tear through the dining room, where she'd eaten thousands of meals in silence. She watched it obliterate the grand staircase Richard had been so proud of. She watched it expose the dark, damp secret of the basement to the cleansing light of day. She sat there for hours, a silent sentinel at the funeral of her own prison. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She felt nothing. A profound, hollow, and utterly liberating absence of feeling. The knot of dread that had lived in her stomach for as long as she could remember was simply gone. It was the quiet after a bomb blast, the stillness after a fever breaks. It was relief. When the last wall fell and the house was nothing but a jagged pile of rubble, a scar on the neat suburban landscape, she put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. She didn't look back. There was nothing there to see. A year bled into the next. The seasons turned, healing the wound in the earth where the house had been. The scandal became history, a lurid Wikipedia entry people stumbled upon during late-night internet deep dives. Elizabeth was gone. Not dead, but erased. She lived now in a small, bright apartment in a quiet, coastal town in Maine. The walls were white, the furniture was simple and comfortable, and the large picture window looked out not on a manicured lawn, but on the restless grey chop of the Atlantic Ocean. The air here was clean and sharp, with the scent of salt and pine. It was the smell of a world washed clean. She was anonymous, Mrs. Smith to her neighbours. A quiet widow who kept to herself, took long walks, and read books from the local library. No one knew her story. No one knew the name Gardner. Here she was a blank slate. Her only tether to the past was Chloe. They spoke once a week on a secure, encrypted video call. Chloe was thriving. She had legally changed her last name to her mother's maiden name and was in her final year at university studying forensic psychology. She was brilliant and fierce, and in her Elizabeth saw a future she had helped secure. The first grant was awarded last week. Elizabeth said, her voice calm as she watched the digital image of her granddaughter's face. To a small shelter in Oregon that specializes in helping people leave coercive relationships. "You're really doing it?" Chloe said, a proud smile spreading across her face. "I am," Elizabeth affirmed. She had taken every last cent of her own pre-marriage assets, the clean money, and placed it in a trust managed by a discreet lawyer in Boston. The trust funded a new foundation, one with a vague, unassuming name. Its mission, however, was razor sharp, to provide resources for the survivors of covert psychological abuse. It was her penance and her purpose. A way to build something new from the ashes of what she had destroyed. After the call, she put on a warm coat and a woolen hat and walked out of her apartment building. The wind coming off the ocean was cold and relentless, a physical presence against her face. She walked down the path to the beach. It wasn't a pretty beach of white sand and sunshine. It was a rugged Maine coastline, strewn with smooth, dark stones and tangled seaweed pounded by a fierce, indifferent surf. She walked along the waterline, the waves hissing as they retreated over the pebbles. The sky was a vast, unforgiving sheet of grey. She looked out at the horizon at the endless expanse of water, churning and powerful and free. For 50 years, her future had been a tiny, cramped room with a locked door. Her life had been stolen, her family had been a lie, her home a prison. Richard had taken everything he could. But he couldn't take this. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, feeling the bite of the wind. She thought of the woman at the airport, the woman she had been sitting on a hard plastic chair, a forgotten piece of luggage. She had been a victim then. She was not a victim now. Freedom, she reflected, looking out at the immense, unknowable ocean, wasn't a gift. It wasn't something handed to you. It wasn't something you waited for. It was something you took. You reached into the fire, and you pulled it out with your own 2 hands, and you didn't care if you got burned. The future stretched out before her as vast and as blank as the sea. And for the first time in her adult life, it was hers. Hers alone to write.